I thought that this morning deserved a conversation about the wave of anti-Semitism that's washing over this country. And I thought since the format was so popular of Rabbi Feinstein and I having a discussion, debate during the high holidays, that we should return to that format. I don't want to spoil this for you, but we're both firmly against anti-Semitism. And one of the strangest trends in synagogue life today, strangest, and there are a lot of strange things that happen in synagogues, so this really takes the cake, is the expectation that synagogues should make these statements against anti-Semitism when I think it should be assumed that every synagogue across the world stands firmly against anti-Semitism. But if you need to hear it from me, and I hope I'm not changing any policy, VBS stands firmly against anti-Semitism. I just want to start and frame this conversation. I don't want to start by talking about Kanye West, Candace Owens, Kyrie Irving, who was the latest one yesterday to come out and endorse tropes of anti-Semitism in social media. I don't want to talk about Piers Morgan. I don't want to talk about Tucker Carlson, who continue to give voice, to allow space in the media for these conversations to go on a national level. I don't want to talk about swastikas on desks at Harvard Westlake, and I don't want to talk about flyers being distributed throughout Brentwood. I'll begin by framing it within the context of the Torah. I made a film a few years ago called Roadmap Genesis, where my claim was that everything that we need to know about society is explained to us in the first book of the Torah, Sefer Bereshit. And as I sat in Alan Dershowitz's office at Harvard Law School, he explained to me that there always is a common law before there is law. And Bereshit establishes the common law of our society. And embedded within that common law, Rabbi Sachs was the first one that I ever heard teach this. Anti-Semitism is introduced in Sefer Bereshit. How so? I'm in the Chumash right now in chapter 43 of the book of Genesis. Joseph brings his brothers down to Egypt. And there it's explained, I'm in chapter 43, verse 32. They served him by himself, Benjamin, and they ate by themselves. The Egyptians who ate by themselves, for the Egyptians could not dine with Hebrews, since that was abhorrent to the Egyptians. From the beginning, this cancer has affected society. And it's carried by the basket of inconsequentials. None of the Egyptians are named. None of the people who stood on the overpass of the 405 that hung those signs, they're faceless, nameless people in society. The trouble is when people stand at microphones who are popular or who wield popularity and begin to build movements surrounded by, supported by foundational anti-Semitic tropes. We all know the terrible outcomes that come from that. I'm a grandchild of 4 survivors of the Shoah. When somebody stands at a microphone or now types into their cell phone and tens of millions of people hear it and millions of people like it immediately, then the Jewish community has to address it. And I would argue it's incumbent on the rest of society to address it as well. Because we know that when it starts with Jews, it does not end with Jews. And so I guess I'll begin here, and then I'll hand it over to Rabbi Feinstein, and then I'll come back to the microphone, and we'll go back and forth for as long as we have appetite, as long till lunch, right, until Musaf. And that is I'll tell you a brief story, and then I'll hand it over, and that is my family, my personal family. We are actually we straddle two different schools right now, two different day schools. Right, one is here at VBS, which we love. The other is my older two children are finishing up this year at middle school, and we love their experience at Sinai Kiba Academy, where they've been for the last almost 14, 15 years. And my son played flag football last year, and the flag football team isn't very good at Sinai, and I didn't see a lot of merit in it, and so he's not playing it this year. But there's a new coach for the flag football team because it would be solved if the flag football coach had greater experience, and so the flag football coach, who's a product of Division I football, on the way back from the flag football game this week, the topic of Kanye West came up, and this football coach, the only adult, the only chaperone on the bus, began to explain to the team of children, some of my son's closest friends in the world, that Kanye West is right. That everything that he says about Jews are correct. And the promise, the glimmer of hope for the Jewish people is that those children on the bus stood up and said, "That's not true. Sit down. You are speaking lies." And why that's a glimmer of hope is that the generation of my grandparents didn't feel like they could. There are a lot of reasons to feel like we should be scared. Don't. We should feel exactly the opposite. We should double down on our Jewish identities. We should be prouder and louder and out in the streets talking about how wonderful it is to be Jews. We should encourage our kids to do the same. I didn't grow up in this era. I grew up in the 80s and 90s. Nobody ever said anything anti-Semitic to me in my entire life. My children are growing up in a very different reality in 2022. And we have to equip them with a muscle that I never had to exercise. And I'm proud to say that the day schools and the religious schools in this community know the challenge before us, and I think are prepared to answer the bell. Rabbi Feinstein?
Okay. My parents grew up in the 30s and 40s in America. They're the children of immigrants. They grew up in a very different world. Father Coughlin was on the radio, a viciously anti-Semitic preacher, very popular in America. Charles Lindbergh was a public figure, led a movement called America First, which claimed that Jews were trying to bring America into the war in order to profit from wartime industries. Ivy League schools were closed to Jews. Whole industries were closed to Jews. Clubs and neighborhoods were closed to Jews. Very famous story that Groucho Marx was once invited to the LA Country Club for lunch by his producers. His kids were splashing in the pool, and the manager came over and said, "Mr. Marx, I'm going to ask you to ask your kids to come out of the pool. This is a restricted club." And his answer was, "Listen, they're only half Jewish. Let them go in up to their waist." I mean, that was a normal thing in the 30s and the 40s and even into the 50s. I grew up in a very different world. And maybe it was a bubble, knowing Jewish life and Jewish history and the history of anti-Semitism throughout the generations of the Jewish people. Perhaps I grew up in a bubble. But like Rabbi Lebovitz, I didn't encounter this. I mean, there was a kid in school who called me a dirty Jew, and I decked him. And I got suspended from school. And my father picked me up and took me out for breakfast at the IHOP. And then we spent the day together watching The Twilight Zone, because he was proud of me. And the next day I was back in school and the kid apologized to me and it was over. I grew up in a bubble. I grew up in a bubble where this stuff didn't happen. I mean, my grandfather, who was an immigrant from Romania, and from Poland, my grandfather had a fear of anyone in a uniform. He would take me on a walk, and if he saw someone in a uniform, didn't matter if it was a policeman or a fireman or a mailman or a soldier or a desk clerk or the doorman in a building, he would grab me and pull me across the street because he grew up in a world where uniforms were bad for Jews. I grew up in a different world, and our children are growing up in a different world. Today, the Secretary of State of the United States of America is a Jew. He's the stepchild of Holocaust survivors. The Secretary of the Treasury is a Jew. The Attorney General of the United States is a Jew. The Director of the Homeland Security Department is a Jew. There's Jews sitting on the Supreme Court of the United States of America. In the previous administration, the daughter of the previous president is an Orthodox Jew, raising her children as Orthodox Jews. In the previous generation, the president every year held a very widely publicized and coveted invitation to a White House Seder every year. It's a different world that we grow in. Stanford University just published an apology to its alumni because they uncovered the admissions records, which showed that there was a very tightly held quota on Jewish students coming into Stanford in the 40s and the 50s and in the 60s. They took one kid a year from Beverly Hills High School and no kids from Fairfax High School. Why? Because Beverly and Fairfax are two most Jewish high schools in the state of California. And Stanford. Princeton University had a very tight quota against Jews. Today, the president of Princeton University is Jewish. Most of the Ivy League presidents are Jewish. It's a very different world. So when we encounter anti-Semitism in our generation, it is a shock. It's hard to understand. We're not used to this. From the perspective of Jewish history, we've never had it so good. But from the perspective of this generation, this comes as a shock. And it should be a shock. It reminds us of the way that our ancestors lived in all these generations and what they had to cope with. Now, in this particular case, there's some personal things going on. Mr. West is not a well man. He's been diagnosed as mentally ill, lost his mother a few years ago. She was his connection to the world. And there are many weird things that he said, but the problem with Kanye West isn't Kanye West. That Kanye West doesn't want to daven mincha this afternoon, I understand. It's all the other people he gives opening to, the crazies out there who are waiting to do violence. 3 years ago, I opened the high holidays by apologizing to the community that you had to pass a phalanx of armed guards and metal detectors to get into shul. That's not the way anyone should come to worship. The tragedy is that when my Presbyterian and Episcopalian friends come to shul to visit, they don't have to go through metal detectors to go to their churches. We don't have to go to metal detectors to get into a mall or a movie theater, but you have to go through a metal detector to come to shul. And this is something that I'm deeply sorry for, that our children have to experience this. But this is now a reality. Why does it happen? Well, Lord Acton, the great British moralist, once wrote that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, but there is a corollary. And the corollary is that powerlessness corrupts. When people find themselves in a position of powerlessness and can't control the conditions of their own existence, when the world is changing around them and they can't keep up, when they don't understand what is happening to them, when they have a sense that the world that is familiar to them, a world where they belong, a world where they're in control, a world where they are somebody, is being taken from them. And they have nobody to figure out, help them understand this. Instead of looking inside, which is what a mature person does, and says, what can I do to cope with this new circumstance and how can I enjoy it? They project their powerlessness outward. and their rage outward, and they find someone else to blame. Usually someone who's different than they are. Someone whose skin is of a different color, whose lifestyle is of a different tenor, whose faith is different, someone who has a history of being blamed already. And that's where anti-Semitism comes from. It is a reflection on the weakness within of people who find something within themselves that they hate, but rather than turn inward to fix that, it's so much easier to project it outward and to hate. And the real danger, as the rabbi mentioned, is that they will take this and go destroy that which they hate. And that's the reason why we have these wonderful men and women who stand in front of the synagogue with very large weapons on their hip, so that they are deterred from doing this thing. It's what Rabbi Jacobs talked about, setting boundaries. It is very hard to change a person's mind when they are coming from that place of anger and hate and helplessness and projecting that onto us. All of the educational programs in the world are not going to convince them. What we can try to do is to reach them before they get to that point. The children, to talk about what hate does to each other and what it means to live in a diverse society of multiple cultures and multiple races and multiple languages and multiple faiths. That we can do. What we can do is set boundaries that are hard and fast and strong and be vigilant. What we can do is support a liberal democratic society that is open to all different kinds of people. And be on the lookout not just for expressions of hate against ourselves, but expressions of hate against anybody. Against anybody. Because that is what maintains a sense of security for us all. And I know there's a real Jewish sort of obsession with this, because all of us have an inside alarm that says it's getting dangerous for us. But it gets dangerous from us when a gay or trans kid is beat up outside of their high school. It gets dangerous for us when a Latino family can't find a place to go to stay in a hotel. It gets dangerous for us when anyone is discriminated against in this society. We have to be able to be vigilant about the protection and sensitivity to an entire democratic liberal landscape, because that's where we are safest. That's where we are safest. And that becomes our task. And that's hard for us to do, because we'd like to just live our private lives and not be involved. We'd like to keep our politics to ourselves and not get involved. But sometimes the world says, I won't let you have that privacy. I won't let you have that privilege. You need to get involved. And this is one of those moments.
In each new time that this cancer emerges, we can't look always to previous times to how we deal with it. The answers in the 60s and 70s and 80s are not the answers necessarily for 2020, and we need to learn that quickly. We need to learn quickly that the answer might be outward, creating alliances, inviting communities into our community, reaching out to those communities who espouse hate. And at the same time, the answers might be by looking inward. In the late 19th century, there was a young journalist, not the young journalist that we're all thinking about in Europe, the other young journalist, whose name was Zev Jabotinsky. And he said as a young man that there were countless times in his life when people would walk by him on the street and spit in his face and call him a dirty Jew. And his instinct was to always wipe his face and keep walking. And he declared that that instinct was over. that nobody would ever be allowed to spit in his face again and call him a dirty Jew without him speaking up, fighting back, whatever the situation called for. He would lose fight after fight after fight after fight. And he dreamt of the day when a generation would emerge whose instinct would be to fight because they believed in their whole heart they could win. He taught leaders of that generation to do that same exact thing. When conflicts erupt between Israel and her neighbors, I see on social media all of my friends post Jewish stars everywhere. That we're Jewish and proud, we stand with our brothers and sisters in Israel. Because their Israeliness affects us. And in moments of anti-Semitism like this in this country, I don't see Jewish stars all across social media. Because it feels very much like a diasporic problem. But in those moments, we should let the Israelness affect us. Our response now should be louder and prouder. The exact mediums that attack us are mediums that we belong to. And our kids have to know how to respond in those scenarios because they're not growing up in the 80s and 90s. And this isn't going away anytime soon. There are problems with anti-Semitism on both sides of the polarized society right now. And we can't shy away from this conversation. We can't shy away from it because our kids read about it and hear about it and know about it every day on their cell phones and iPads and everything that they read. They need to be guided and taught what they should do. This synagogue is going to welcome this conversation and every conversation that affects Jewish life here into the holiest of spaces. And I look forward to engaging with you if you'd like to carry this conversation further. Shabbat Shalom. We've always been a people that stood between celebrations and between difficult conversations and difficult moments. And for that we have an anthem. It's the modern Israeli song written by Naomi Shemer, Al Kol Eleh.
על הדבש ועל העוקץ, על המר והמתוק, על ביתנו התינוקת, שמור אלי הטוב, על האש המבוערת, על המים הזכים, על האיש השב הביתה מן המרחקים, על כל שמור נא לי הטוב על הדבש ועל העוקץ על המר והמתוק על נטע הקור נטוע אל תשכח